Hello, everyone. Welcome to VizConnect, connecting you with the art of data visualization and storytelling. My name is Sagar Kapoor. I'm part of customer success team at Tableau. So VizConnect is a weekly global Tableau community call, which helps you to connect, inspire, and motivate with Tableau initiatives. We have a YouTube channel. Go ahead, subscribe to it. Some great content waiting for you. We have a LinkedIn group. Go ahead, connect with each other and learn from each other. With that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. It's an honor to introduce Sarah Battersby. So Sarah is a principal research scientist on the Tableau research team. Sarah's primary area of focus is cartography with an emphasis on cognition. Her work emphasizes how to help everyone visualize and use spatial information more effectively. No advanced degree in geospatial required. She holds a PhD in GI science from the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's a member of the International Cartographic Association member Commission on Map Projections and is a past president on the Cartography and Geographic Information Society. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sarah to talk about all over the map in Tableau. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Sagar. It's neat to be able to share content again. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining. Whatever time zone it happens to be, it is 5:30 in the morning for me here in Seattle. So you get to see how excited I can be at this time of day. As Sagar mentioned, I'm going to talk about a number of different map types in Tableau. And one of the things that I really like to do when I'm talking about mapping is, I always want to start with the basics. So we're going to start with this basic workbook, and I'm going to use a data set. It's called 311 service requests, and it's from the city of Boston, from their open data portal. And this is a data set that I like to use for what I consider my love letter to Tableau. It is so easy to make a map in Tableau. I think this really highlights a lot of the ways that we can get at this fundamental mapping question of where are things and how is it distributed? Because that's really how things are distributed is really the basic question that most people ask with mapping. And this particular data set gets at the heart of one of the problems that I care about a whole lot, which is how do we find patterns and understand whether or not they're everything that's in the data, whether it's the true pattern or whether we might want to look a little bit further to understand what else could be going on in our data set. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump straight into this workbook and use it to talk about some of the basics of mapping. And then I'm going to move on to some more complex and a little bit out there map types. We'll talk about map projections a little bit. We'll talk about some alternative map styles. I've got a number of different things that we'll go through. So with this Boston data set, in case you're not familiar, so this 311 service request idea, these are all point locations where people who live in the city can report problems, whether it's graffiti, a pothole in the road, sprinkler that's broken windows, things that the city needs to come out and fix. And it's nice because it's a pretty large data set. So this data set has just this portion of the data set that I'm working with has 222,000 data points in it, and they're all point locations. So it's a reasonably large size data set, which lets us look at a lot of problems with trying to understand spatial distributions. So the first thing we generally want to look at is just where is the data? And that's a great question to throw onto a map. So what I have in this data set, and I'll just jump back and show you the data source real quickly. It is just a big text file. I downloaded it. It's a CSV. I mean, it's just a comma separated value file with a lot of text, a lot of details in it. And it has some things that are clearly location based. So I've got latitude and longitude. So I know that I can attach those to a place on the Earth's surface, but it has a number of other attributes in it that associate themselves with location, even though they aren't specifically, they don't have geographic coordinates attached to them in this text file, like neighborhood name or city council district. And we'll use some of those to look at distributions. But I wanted to show you that there is nothing special in this file with respect to spatial data. It's just text file. So I can take my latitude and longitude and drop it on the map. And all of a sudden, I have a data point. I can see that this is in Massachusetts in the United States, but it's just one data point because Tableau loves to aggregate things. And for spatial data, we may not want the average of latitude and longitude, so we disambiguate. And I'm going to use this case enquiry ID, which is just a unique identifier for all of the data points. So that lets me see, here's how everything is distributed. Here's the basics of where all of the calls came from. I can zoom in, I can take a closer look at where these are occurring, get a sense of what streets they're on. And we'll actually take a look at the base map real quickly, because this is where we're getting the fundamental context for understanding distributions. Right now I can see street names, but there are other really nice background map types. Like there's this streets format that actually has things like building footprints, playgrounds, a lot of points of interest that are built in. And you can turn those layers on and off inside the properties for our base maps. But I wanted to just show those as a nice way of getting some context to understand distributions of where these points are falling. So that's the first thing. We can always just make a map and look at the distribution. So I'm going to zoom out and we're going to talk about how useless this particular distribution is, because there's so much data. You really can't get a good sense of how this data set is distributed across our area of interest. All I can see is that there's a big blob of data. It's just such a dense data set. So what we want to do is we want to start looking at ways that we can explore this data set with other visualizations to help us understand how it's really distributed across the city. And before I go too far into that, I want to show you another nice thing about Tableau. So I've used latitude and longitude over here in the marks card to map the locations, but I don't have to use those fields specifically. I can put them together into a single field if that's easier to work with. Let me just drag this back over. So there's a function in Tableau called make point. And what that does is it converts an X and a Y coordinate into a geometry. And Tableau can work with that as a single point location geometry. And this is a really great feature that has what I call a hidden functionality in it, because I think a lot of people don't know about it. When I bring up the help file or bring up the context menu on this, there's a second make point option. So here it says make point number. So that's where I have my latitude and longitude. Or there's this other option to have make point. You put in a number, a second number, and a third number. That magical third number means that you can work with data that is not latitude and longitude in Tableau and convert it directly into a point location. So if you know the spatial reference ID, if you have projected coordinates, perhaps you're using UTM grid or some other known coordinate system, you can just put that that SRID, that spatial reference ID in, and have Tableau turn it into a point directly and be able to drop that onto the map. So here, instead of dropping latitude and longitude on directly, I could just bring the geometry on. I just wanted to show that as kind of a side note, because sometimes it's nicer to work with one field than two. And if you have data that is not latitude and longitude, but is projected coordinates, that will help you put it onto the map so you can start to see your distributions. But as we saw on that last map, when I add all of the data points, it really just becomes this big blob, and I can't see a whole lot of what the distribution is. So we have a number of other fields in this data set that can help us see different levels of aggregation on our data. And one of them is zip code. So there's a field called location zip code. Here's the postal code for each of these point locations that's been assigned. It's nothing, there's no geometry attached to it. It's really just a numeric or an alphanumeric postal code, but I can drop that on the map. And Tableau can render that into polygons, because we have a number of different geocoding polygons that you can use just based on a character ID. So city names, state names, province names, country names, county or county equivalents, postal codes, there are a number of different geocoding levels that are available. And so now that I've added these zip codes, Tableau will render the polygons for me, and it can automatically aggregate all of the data into those. So if I want to know how many of these requests came in each postal code, I can just drop the count onto the map. But there's a strange thing that's happening. I could put my mouse over any of these locations and see for that postal code how many service requests came in that zip code. But if you look closely, all of these blue shades on the map in this filled symbol map, they're relatively light. But if you look over on the right of the screen, the legend is showing this 48,000 value as the largest value on the map. And that doesn't seem to be showing up anywhere, because what's happening is there are a number of unknown locations. So where the zip code was null, it's not going to show up on the map. So I can go ahead and filter those out. And now I can see a different distribution. So that's the first problem that sometimes comes up, which is making sure that what you're seeing on the map is actually matching the legend, and that you don't have any null values that might be throwing the distribution. Because the distributions here, let me just go back, I see a different pattern in this map than I do when I remove those data locations. Now I can actually see, okay, zip code 02128, it really is emphasized that a majority of the requests are coming from this zip code here, zip code 02127. I can start to see this area up more in the northeast part of the city where I'm getting a heavier density of the service requests, which I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't removed all of those null values. So one thing to point out, this is a filled symbol map. We can also really easily change this to, say, a circle mark type, and then put our service requests on size instead of on color. And so now instead of having the filled symbol map, I now have a proportional symbol map, which may just give you another way of looking at the data that's useful to you. Or if you wanted to overlay this with another data set, so you wanted some filled polygons in the background, and then the sized symbols on top to be able to compare multiple attributes. But maybe you don't have a named location that lines up with something in our geocoding data set. And so this data set, for instance, has neighborhoods, and these are neighborhood names. So it's more of a local identifier that is interesting to people who live in the area. But that isn't a level of detail that Tableau has specifically. I can still aggregate up the count. I'll just drop count on this table. We'll make a quick bar chart, and I can sort them. And I can see the name of which geographic neighborhood has the most requests, but I can't see it on the map yet. But Tableau, since it supports spatial files, we can actually look at that pattern really easily. So I'll just go over to another file or another worksheet, and I'm going to add on the geometry for all of the Boston neighborhoods. And I'll go ahead and put name on detail so we can see the name of each of these neighborhoods. And we can summarize up our 311 requests into all of these neighborhoods really quickly. And again, we see the same problem where our legend is going up to 68,000, but we're not seeing that same value on the map, because down here in the right corner, this is always a great corner to keep your eye on. It lets me know that there are some null values. There are some records that don't have a neighborhood listed. So if I filter those out, I'll recalibrate the map, and I can see that with this distribution, I no longer have the bulk of my requests coming from that northeast portion of the map, but really more from this pure, just sort of central and eastern neighborhood. So I'm seeing a different pattern that's coming out, and I'll just compare that really quickly to our zip codes. I'll go back to a filled map so you can see the comparison a little more easily. The filled zip codes versus the neighborhood map. We're seeing a different pattern come out. If I had only looked at one of these maps, I wouldn't have been able to see this different pattern. Now, let me just show you how this gets put together, because I'm using a geometry that isn't built into Tableau. So on the data source, it's really just two files. I have my text file of the 311 requests, and then I have this GeoJSON file, which is a spatial data file that I also picked up from the open data portal from the city of Boston. And I'm just joining them on a common field. So the 311 requests have a field called neighborhood, which is just a character set for the neighborhood name. And it matches up to this name field in the Boston neighborhoods GeoJSON file. So I can link those together and then use that secondary geography to be able to explore the distribution of my point data just based on a regular join. But I want to get a little bit more complex because sometimes the geography that you're really interested in may not have a text identifier. And so you actually need to use a spatial relationship in order to figure out where points are with respect to this other geography that's interesting to you. So I'm going to look at census tracts. So in the United States, this is something we have the United States Census, and they count the population and keep tabs on a number of attributes about the population. And one of the things that they provide is a lot of geographic files because you want to be able to attach these counts that they have to locations. So the census tract is a really common geography that's used. But this 311 data set that I have from the city of Boston doesn't have an identifier for census tract. But I can get all of the geographies of the census tracts. I can get them from the US Census, I can get them from the city of Boston, I can get them from a lot of different places. And I want to be able to take the point locations in my Boston data set and use them with the census tracts. So I'll go ahead and build up the visualization and then show you how it was put together. So I have this census data set. It's the Census 2010 tracts. And it comes in with a shape, so it's the geometry, and I can just drop that onto my map. And I'm going to make sure that each one knows what census tract they are using their identifier. So now I have all of these individual census tracts, and I can sum up my requests into those census tracts. And I'm getting a really weird pattern. So let me show you how this was built, and then we'll talk about why all of a sudden I see something that is completely different than any of the other patterns that we've seen, whether we were looking at the raw point locations, the zip codes, or the neighborhood locations. So the way that this is put together is just a little bit different. It looks like I have a single data source, but if I double click on it, it opens up this classic join from Tableau. And I've got on the left side the text file with my 311 requests. And on the right side, I have this file of census tracts. And I'm joining them together using this spatial function called intersects. So intersects lets me take a geometry, a point level geometry, and I'm using my Boston 311 requests. You can see my join calculation is just taking the latitude and longitude and turning it into a point, and is intersecting with the shape from the census tracts. And that shape is a polygon. So I can use the point geometry from my text file and the polygon geometry from my census tracts and say, Tableau, figure out which polygon each one of these points falls inside. You don't have to have a name match, you just have to have a geography that matches up. And so this is where we get this really different pattern. The other maps that I've shown you, zip codes and neighborhoods, are all based on attributes that were reported in that text file. So they said, this is my neighborhood, I know that I'm right here, which could be totally right or totally wrong. And with census tracts, because we're using the geography, we're saying, this is my location, my latitude and longitude, and this is the polygon. Now tell me if I'm inside it or not. And what I see is that 52,000 of the data points geographically fall inside this one particular polygon. And that's really kind of weird because it's such a different pattern. It washes out the distribution of everything else in the data set. And I'm going to come back to that location in just a second, and we're going to get rid of that problem. But I want to show you another way that we can highlight that problem. So let's say you don't have any spatial data files that you can use to aggregate the data. You don't have a census tract equivalent or something else like that. we're going to use a visualization type that's built into Tableau that lets you really quickly see spatial distributions without having to assign the point locations to polygons to create these filled symbol maps. And that is the density mark type. So I have all of these point locations, and I'm going to create what people call a density map or a heat map. I'm just going to change the mark type, and Tableau is going to look at where all of these points are located and come up with this, kind of this aggregated density surface. And I see something really strange happening, because when I just look at the raw point locations, I see data all over the place. And when I switch to the density mark type, almost everything is getting washed out, except for this one hotspot. And so what we can do is we can drill in on that hotspot and try and figure out what in the world is going on. I'm just going to keep zooming in, and we're going to take a look at the detail on here. And it turns out, you can select these points in Tableau. There are 50,000 data points stacked on top of each other, and all of those are stacked really close to City Hall. And so my theory on this, without knowing the data set really well or how it's collected, is that this is probably the default location. We didn't know what neighborhood this was in, or we didn't know, some other detail. These are probably all of our nulls that were coming up on the other visualizations. And so when you look at these other visualizations like census tracts or density that are really just pure location based, this problem area shows up. And so I've managed to get rid of it. I figured out that they all had exactly the same latitude and longitude. So I created a little calculated field where I can get rid of those points, because I think that they're all kind of anomalous. So I'll just get rid of them, and we'll go ahead and zoom back out to full extent. And you can see a different pattern that's showing up on the map. But I would not have found that these points were a problem without looking at the census tract version of the map or the density version of the map, because it was really dealing with what is the purely spatial distribution of the raw point locations. Now we'll go and look at the tract data set, and we can use that same anomaly to clean up this pattern. So I'm going to add this is anomaly over to my worksheet, so I can just turn it on and off easily. And I'm going to show you what the calculation is. Because I just zoomed in on that location and I found out that there really were 50,000 points with exactly the same latitude and longitude, and they were stacked on top of each other. So I just decided to eliminate all of those points. And so I said, if your latitude is this particular value and your longitude is this particular value, let's go ahead and just label you as an anomalous location. So if I'm doing any location-based analytics, I know that I can just get rid of those, remove them from the pattern. And here I just turned off those anomaly points, and I can see a little bit better what the real distribution is of my data in the census tracts. One last way of looking at the data, you might really want to use an arbitrary geography. Census tracts, counties, states, provinces, countries, all of these geographies are great and they have specific meaning behind them, but they're also problematic in that they have very different shapes, very different sizes. And so when you're counting up point locations inside all of them, you can have some problems with the fact that big locations tend to just have more stuff in them. They tend to have more people. They tend to have more things that happen. And so sometimes you end up with these patterns where it's really just the big places have more stuff, the small places have less stuff, and that isn't always very interesting. But if you use something like a nice regular geography, so these are hexagonal bins, and I just created a grid of hexagons, which I did externally in a free and open source geographic information system called QGIS, and it takes probably about 1.5 minutes for me to generate hex bins. I have a blog post about it up on the Tableau community forums if you're interested, that'll explain how to make this sort of bin. But it gives you this nice regular geography to aggregate your data. And what I can use that for in Tableau is I can use it in a similar way to the census tracts. Let me just see if I can get back to the data source real quickly. So I have my text file of 311 requests, and then I have this spatial file of hexagons, and I can join them together with an intersection as well. So it's saying, take these point locations from my text file and compare them to the polygon locations in my hexagon file. And now I can count up all of my 311 requests into those hexagons. And again, I get that same weird anomaly problem where this particular hexagon has a ton of requests. And once I turn that off, then I can get a nice sort of smooth, continuous change pattern of, for how these requests come in across the city without being constrained by the challenges of these arbitrary geographies that have different shapes and different sizes. And just to make it a little bit clearer how you can get nice patterns out of this, I'll put the dark base map on and turn the outline off around all of the hexagons, and you can really just see a little bit more of the smoother continuous change that you had, similar to the density mark type, but with the added benefit that with the hex bins, I can select any one of these and say, tell me about the points that are exactly right here in this location or in this collected location. It just makes it easier to tie points to very specific locations versus the density mark type that's more of this aggregated smoothed pattern. So I want to show one other nice feature, and this is something that's coming out in the 2021.2 release. So I'm actually using the pre-release version of 2021.2 because I really like this feature. So in Tableau, starting in 2020.4, you could introduce geographic layers. So I've got a number of different marks cards over here on the left side of my view. I've got my zip codes. I've got hex bins. I have the point locations. I have the density mark type. I have all of these different layers that I can turn on. But with the 2021.2 release, we're introducing this nice layer control. So I'm just going to turn on my layer controls, and that'll give map readers, so whether this is on a dashboard, up on Tableau Public or anywhere else, you can control those layers. So if I want to be able to compare, for instance, the zip codes and the hex bins, I can just have those two layers on, and then I can change my is anomaly and turn that off and get rid of those data points. And I can compare those patterns more directly, see one on top of the other, or I could turn the hex bins off and turn the density mark type on, and I can see how those patterns relate to one another. So it's a nice way of being able to look at multiple distributions and think about how they might represent your data set a little bit differently. So this is my way of talking about how, when you really want to start with this fundamental question of how is data distributed, it often helps to look at more than one visualization, because the patterns may actually be different, and it can help you find problems in your data set, and problems that may really be driven by the type of visualization that you're using. So I want to move over to a different mapping problem, because we've just looked at several pretty common map types, but I want to go a bit farther out on how you can visualize spatial patterns with some more creative map types. Those are all just things that were built into Tableau, really easy to make. But I want to go to some of the questions that people often ask me about trying to do things that you don't necessarily seem like, Tableau just does these things. Well, it turns out Tableau can do some really cool, powerful mapping things. You just have to get creative. So I want to give you some ideas on ways that we can look at data in other creative ways. So I'm going to use a data set for the Gini coefficient. So it's a measure of income inequality or wealth inequality at the country level. And we could start by looking at, what if I have a data set and I just downloaded a data set from a website that tracks Gini coefficients, and I got a text table with country names. I can just double click on that in Tableau, add it to the map. Okay, here are all of the countries that are represented in this data set. I can change it to a filled map. Yeah, there are a couple countries that aren't included and they're just grayed out. But most countries are represented here. And I can drop on the attribute for the Gini coefficient. I'll just put that on color. And great, so now I have a map. Easy, that was nice. I can see the Gini coefficient for any country. I'll just put my cursor over it. I can get a sense of what that value is. But a question that I get pretty regularly is, this is nice, but the base map in Tableau is Web Mercator. And Web Mercator distorts areas as you move away from the equator. So, Greenland is huge, Canada is pretty huge, Russia is pretty huge because they're farther away from the equator. So I want to be able to see this data in an equal area projection. And how can I do that? So let's look at how we could do that. So I have that same Gini index CSV, and it has country names in it. And I have brought in an outside data set because Tableau supports spatial files. So I brought in a set of country line work from this. There's a project called Project Line Work, and they have a lot of really interesting creative boundary files that you can use. So I'm using something called Moriarty Hand, which is kind of a hand-drawn looking file. And I'll go over to the data source and show you how I have linked my data. So I have my Gini World Population Review data set, and then I have a set of admin 0 or country level polygons, and I have translated those into an equal Earth projection that I'm going to use in Tableau. So I'm going to open up my polygons, and I'm just going to drop my countries on the map. Actually, I'm not going to drop those countries on the map because those are the wrong countries. I'm going to drop my geometry on the map. And I have a map that looks a little bit weird. So what's happening here is I have the Tableau base map, which shows up by default in the background on any one of my maps that I try and create. But I have this other set of polygons that's rendering on top that is kind of offset a little bit. So let me go ahead and open up the properties for my map layers. And I'm going to wash out my base map because I don't need the Tableau base map, because now I have these polygons that look a little bit more like I want them. So this is using a map projection called Equal Earth, which is an equal area map projection, which I think looks fairly nice. And I've got my polygons. They have names attached to them. And because I've joined it to the data set with the Gini index or the Gini coefficient, I can then drop that onto color. I'm going to get rid of my null. And I have exactly the same data, but I have it in a map projection that may look a little bit nicer or may represent the data, in my mind, kind of in a more fair sort of way, because this is an equal area map projection. So I'm taking out that distortion that something like Web Mercator has for area. Now, I want to show you one other thing with this data set, which is there are some countries that actually don't have values. So for instance, South Sudan does not have a Gini coefficient assigned to it. And it's still showing up as this light blue color. So its shading on the map looks exactly the same as, say, the shading for the United States or the shading for Greenland, which also does not have a value, or Antarctica. So maybe it would be nice to be able to show those as no data values. So I created a little calculation. And it just says, is the Gini coefficient null? And if it's null, it means, there's no data there. So I'm going to create a second layer on this map. I'm just going to drop a new layer on as my nulls. And I'm going to assign a color to that based on no data. And I'm going to go ahead and put a name on these so we can see the names as well. And now I'm going to hide all of my false values. So now I've just upgraded my map a little bit. So I have the nicer map projection. I have all of the values for the countries that have Gini coefficients in my data set. And I have this nice grayed out color for all of my locations that have no data. So I could actually clean up the labels on this so it's a little bit nicer, but it's a way of getting some custom map projections in. Now, the way that I do this, and I've got a couple blog posts about this on the Tableau community forums, I took this Linework file that I got from Project Linework, and I brought it into QGIS. That's that free and open source GIS package that I mentioned. And I reprojected it using QGIS. So I changed its map projection. And then I changed the file that tells software what map projection it is. And it's just a text file. So I just manually edited it. And even though the map projection was equal Earth, I said, I want you to think that your map projection is Web Mercator. And what that does is it allows me to trick Tableau into bringing in this projected file and not trying to reproject it at all. That's just a little bit of trickery. And as I said, I have a couple blog posts on the Tableau community forums about how to do this. I'm also starting up a blog series on the Flairledge twins blog. So Kevin and Ken Flairledge are two of the Zen masters for Tableau, and they have an awesome blog of all sorts of things that are cool with Tableau. And so I've started a series with them, which is going to be tips and tricks to using QGIS, this free and open source GIS package, to do some of the spatial data processing to help you make these kind of out there map types. So I also wanted to show you a completely different way of representing locations, because even with equal area projection, you still have to deal with the fact that countries are clearly not the same size and the same shape. So sometimes you want an abstraction, and sometimes you want it because it makes it so that everything is exactly the same size and same shape, and sometimes you want it just because it looks pretty neat. So I have made a tile grid version of the world, and as you can see, we have our Tableau base map showing up underneath. So I am going to go ahead and get rid of that. So I just go back into map layers, and I'm going to wash out the base map so it doesn't show up. But believe it or not, here are all of our countries. And let's just prove that to you. I'm going to put the 2-letter alpha code on each one of them. And let's just color code them by region to start with, so you can start to see the patterns. So here, Africa, all of the countries in Africa is squares. The Americas is squares. Antarctica is a square. Asia has a bunch of squares. And so what this does is it lets us use that abstraction so that now you don't have a giant country with a big value that draws your eye. You have every country with exactly the same shape and size. And again, we can put our Gini coefficient onto these squares and see the same values. Now, what's really fun, I put together a little comparison tool. So let's just go into full screen because we can. So I've got a table that lists all of the countries and the Gini coefficient, and then I have 4 different ways of representing the data. We've got Web Mercator in the upper left. We have equal Earth both on the top right and the bottom right. These are just 2 different levels of simplification of the line work. So I like to look at Australia as my target region on this really simplified one, because it really looks like a toddler drew it. But if you're doing something where the map is going to be really small and really zoomed out, it actually works better than having the more detailed line work, just as kind of a reference. And then we also have our tile grid map on the lower left. So I can put all of these together, and then I can link them. So if I want to know, here's how the Netherlands looks in each of these. Here's how India looks in each of these. Norway, Sweden, Brazil. So you can link them together with actions so that we can highlight, particular locations and see how they would be represented in each one of these visualizations. So I just wanted to bring that up as kind of a fun way of looking at data and being able to use some alternate map projections. Now, the last workbook I wanted to look at gets into the problem of, what happens when you have multiple attributes and you want to be able to make comparisons across locations. it's, making good maps and understanding spatial patterns isn't always just about, here is one data set, here's how that one data set is distributed, great, my problem is solved. It's often about how does that data set relate to some other data set. So here I've got a technique I want to show you, which I think can be really useful for doing these comparisons across multiple values. And it's called bivariate choropleth mapping. So these types of maps, these are called choropleth maps or filled symbol maps. And what I have here is I have two different maps, and we can compare them. We can just move our eyes back and forth from one to the other. I can put my mouse over a location. I can have it highlight on the other map. I can move my cursor down, get the values. I can set up tooltips that have obesity rates and food insecurity rates for that one location. There are ways that I can do comparisons, either visually or through tooltips with having multiple values on the tooltip. But sometimes it helps to have those two values on top of each other because, moving your eyes back and forth between these two maps, especially with a fairly fine level geography, these counties are pretty small. It's hard for me to know if I'm really looking at the same place. So we can build up visualizations that allow us to look at both of these at the same time. So I'm going to use the layer control to walk through this on a dashboard because I think it's a nice way of both showing how layer control can help, but also showing how these data sets relate to one another. So instead of having the two maps side by side, I could use layer control and just be able to turn them on and off. So here is, obesity percentages for counties in the US versus food insecurity. I could just turn these on and off and use that to do comparisons across the two different layers. And that's, that's a little bit helpful. But I could also combine the two data sets. So this is what's called a bivariate choropleth map. So what I've done is I've taken my food insecurity attributes, I've taken my obesity attributes, and I've simplified both of them into 3 different levels. And you can see in the legend over on the right-hand side, I have this combined legend where I have food insecurity rates, low, medium, and high. And then I have obesity rates, low, medium, and high. And I've put them together into a 3x3 matrix. So if you have both a low obesity rate and a low food insecurity rate, you have this really light color. If you have both a high obesity rate and a high food insecurity rate, you have this really dark color. And then if you're somewhere in between, you have some varying combination of the two shades that I'm using to represent these. So all of the food insecurity, we'll just go back and take a look at these layers. All of the food insecurity is being represented in these blue shades. And the obesity rates are being represented in these yellow shades. And then the bivariate combination of the two takes those two different data sets and combines them together. And then we've added an interactive legend, and this is just being driven from a second worksheet. And that lets us interact directly with the map to be able to pull out, oh, just the low obesity rates, or show me everything with a medium obesity rate and a medium food insecurity rate, for instance. And I'll just jump into this worksheet and show you, there's really no secret behind how this gets made. It's just some quick calculations. So for the food insecurity rate, I looked at the quantile breaks and I just manually wrote a calculation that said, if it's lower than a certain value, put it in the low category, then put it in the medium category, put it in the high category. And I did the same thing for obesity rates. If it's lower than a certain value, put it in low or medium or high. So I manually calculated those out and assigned high, medium, or low to each county. And then I combined the two of them. And that is just a very quick, just give me a food insecurity rate and obesity rate as a single field. So it tells me if anything is high, 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 medium, low, medium, etc. So I have this really complicated looking legend over on the right-hand side. And then, but when I map them together, it turns into a much more useful visualization. Or when I look at creating a legend, I can create a quick interactive legend by putting my food insecurity on one axis and my obesity rate on the other axis, and I set them up as square symbols. And then I have a legend that is informative and becomes interactive. So when I put them together on the map, I can now see both of these attributes at the same time and have multiple ways to mine through them. And I'm not going to go into a ton of extra detail. I've written a bit on this as well that you can find up in the Tableau materials. But this visualization technique works for a lot of different types of attributes. So for instance, here is a population change example. So I have a category of high, medium, and low density, but I also have a numeric of loss of value, small growth, or a large amount of growth. So I can look at all of my high density locations or all of my quickly growing locations. Could look at things like predominantly categorical attributes. So this is crops in the United States. What is the dominant crop between corn, soybeans, and wheat, and how much is planted? So if I want to know, in what counties is corn the dominant crop, I can select those out. Or where are my heavily agricultural areas? Here are all of the counties where there's more than 100,000 acres that have been planted. And I can quickly see, which ones of those are more corn focused, which are more soybean focused, and which are more wheat focused. You can also use them for some interactive visualizations. So this shows median family income estimates from the United States American Community Survey dataset. And that's a dataset that is estimated values. And so it has an error rate attached to it. So I've created this as a bivariate map that lets me adjust the acceptable error rate. And as I change that error rate, counties will either become grayed out or not. So if I say, I have a very low tolerance for error, I only want the counties that have a less than 1% error, I can now see those small number of counties that are still bold on the map. And it just allows me to have a little bit of control over how that data gets represented visually. So the things that I'm finding unacceptable from an error rate are going to become more grayed out and move to the background just by using the same bivariate mapping technique. So that is the last map that I wanted to show you. If you have any questions about any of these visualization techniques, or you can't find any of the blog posts that I've mentioned, I can send links, or I could send a set of links over, and we could possibly get them attached to the recording or to the notes related to today's talk. I'd be happy to do that. And I'm always happy if you want to reach out and send me a message. I'm happy to talk about mapping. It's what I like to do. I like doing it enough that I'll get up at 5:30 in the morning to talk about it. So I'll go ahead and stop and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for enlightening us with maps. So if you have any question for Sarah, just go ahead and put it into the chat or the comment section. Happy to go ahead and ask. Sarah, there are a couple of questions over here. One question is from Tim, and he is asking, when using map layers, is there any way to get around the 180 into 360 degrees limit?
I might need clarification on this question, but it's asking about the challenge of kind of the 360-degree world. I'm not sure what the limit is, because we can wrap data around. You can have a world map and we just let you pan continuously around it. So if there are specific files, for instance, that aren't working, that would be something to let me know about, and I'd like to take a look at them.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, because I think then maybe I could see the chat. Or maybe I can, okay, I can still open it. Okay. I found the chat. I don't have the Q&A tab, but.
So
But, I was gonna say, I'd be
please go
happy,
ahead.
I could share my email address if people want to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also on Twitter, and I tend to talk about random map things there, which is a good place to find me.
Sure. I think with the video, I will go ahead and just put your Twitter and LinkedIn profile so that they can just reach out to you over there.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. I think thank you, Sarah, for this session. I think it was an honor and privilege to have you on VizConnect.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great to have the opportunity.
Perfect. I think with that, thank you everyone for joining. I will just go ahead and share the details of Sarah's Twitter and LinkedIn profile. You can reach out to her with any question with respect to map. So with that, thanks a lot for joining. Have a great day ahead and be safe. Thank you.